Hi, I'm Michael Birchall here again, and we now look at two fine homes of note in the colonial period. One of these, Lindsay, is generally acknowledged as the oldest surviving residence in Darling Point, an exclusive eastern suburbs Sydney address. Although a police constable's house, later known as the Octagon, predated the 1833 release of the Darling Point land. Lindsay was built between 1834 and 1836 for colonial treasurer Campbell Drummond Riddle, and is a significant Australian example of the Gothic pre-Victorian phase of the Gothic revival style. I owe much of the details noted herein to Patricia Jacobson. Now, Lindsay is attributed to the local architects James Chadley, Edward Hallen and possibly Francis Clark Riddle. Sold Lindsay in 1838. To the pastoralist politician Thomas Isley, who held it for little more than a year before selling it in 1839 to James Barker, the brother of Thomas Barker. Now, James Barker was an early victim of the 1840s depression in New South Wales and was forced to sell his Darling Point property to meet his large debts. An 1841 subdivision plan of the Lindsay property by James Barker shows that the land at that stage was late the property of Thomas Isley Esquire. In 1841, Surveyor General Sir Thomas Mitchell, of note, in previous videos we have seen him, purchased the Lindsay residence and several surrounding allotments and resided there while building his own harbourside residence, Carthona. Mitchell sold the Lindsay residence in around 1845 and to Dr. Charles Nicholson, surgeon, patron of the arts, co-founder of the University of Sydney and a member of the first New South Wales Legislative Council. Now, William Bradley, a wealthy pastoralist and legislative councillor, lived there with his family from 1849 until Bradley's death in 1868. The next occupant of Lindsay was legislative councillor John McIntosh, who played a significant part in addressing the development problems faced by Darling Point landholders. After McIntosh's death in 1911, subsequent subdivisions greatly reduced Lindsay's footprint and resulted in the loss of its water frontage. In 1914, the house and some land around it was sold to Dr. Edward Jenkins, who undertook additions and internal alterations, and further subdivisions were undertaken in 1919. In 1963, Lindsay's last private owner was Mr. Walter Pye, gifted the house to the National Trust of Australia, in whose care it now remains, and thank you to Mr. Pye for that generosity. In 1841, Sir Thomas Mitchell started to build his new home on the northeastern corner of Darling Point, on a site overlooking Port Jackson and Double Bay, which he named Carthona. Now, we don't know the derivative of this, but it was possibly came from a Scottish Gaelic word meaning the murmur of the waves. How appropriate. Attributed to the architect James Hume, Carthona closely follows the style of a home on the shores of the English Lake Windermere. The Mitchell family lived in Carthona until Mitchell's death in 1855. And in the 1860s and the 1870s it was leased to the Mrs. Cooksey for a girls' school. So there we have a fine example. In the late 19th century, Carthona was owned, well, and or occupied by prominent colonial figures, including the family of the colonial lawyer Arthur Allen. In 1886, the businessman James Sutherland Mitchell, an unrelated neighbour of Sir Thomas Mitchell, purchased Carthona for his son W.B. Mitchell. After W.B. Mitchell's death in 1899, Carthona, together with neighbouring properties, Ethermand and Prudhoe, was advertised for sale between 1900 and 1911. There were successive changes of owners. Two fine residences of this period we can celebrate and admire.